Welcome back, everybody. And this episode, as you might be able to tell, there is some noise going on around me. That is because this is going to be a far less formal episode than the previous episodes. I am recording it from one of my favorite parks on this beautiful sunny day. The sun is chirping and the birds are shining. And I wanted to do something a little different this time. Call it an insert in the regular season. That's why it's called Between the Frames. It's also called Between the Frames because I once heard Martin Scorsese say that when you make a cut in a film, the audience puts something in between the cuts. They psychologically add an image between the frames. And the reason that means something here is that throughout the previous episodes and the episodes to come, I'm not always going to be able to, based on the format, it's a narrative structure, this docu-series, I'm not always going to be able to cover all of the information in the detail that I feel is deserved. So I'm taking this opportunity to really flesh out some more information and some more topics that I think would benefit from further elucidation. So this isn't a pre-written episode, but I want to cover a few extra things that have either been mentioned or briefly glossed over, or just could use a little more expansion from earlier in the season. And I figured the best way to use these Between the Cuts episodes is to use them as benchmarks between the different phases of producing a movie. So we've come to the end of prep. We're almost to production. So this episode will really cover lessons and some further tools from the prep process. And I will do another one at the end of production and another one at the end of post. And that's sort of the overall structure of Between the Frames. So here in this park, I'm going to dive into some of those topics. The topics specifically that I want to cover are balancing time and money, organization, communication, negotiation, time management, and honesty. And then there'll be some additional tools that I have, some recommendations and things like that. Call it further reading. Basically, the takeaway from prep, or what you should be looking for once your prep is done or nearing completion, is you should be looking for the prep process to be getting consistently easier. If you have organized yourself well and organized your crew well and organized your cast well and the overall flow of information and the overall flow of tools that are available to everyone involved has been constructed properly, the process will continue to get easier as you go along because earlier on you set yourself up for success, and because questions are being answered in a more fluid fashion, and the picture should be coming together pretty clearly by the time prep is almost complete. And that's really my main philosophy with prep. Prep is best placed to alleviate the insurmountable level of questions that you, the director or producer or both, are going to have to negotiate your way through come production. And if you're doing it correctly, again, throughout pre-production, those questions should decline as well. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to get questions. That doesn't mean you're not going to have momentary speed bumps. Those speed bumps are inevitable, and they're very difficult to negotiate often. But taking care of as many of the little things throughout the process is really, really, really going to pay in dividends so that the big speed bumps just don't seem so big, because you can apply the most possible focus to addressing them. So all that said, let's jump right into our first topic that I want to cover, which is balancing time and money. This is crucial. I tend to the best of my ability, try to have this philosophy in the front of my mind at all times throughout prep and even throughout production and oftentimes throughout the writing process. And what I mean by balancing time and money, it kind of goes back to that old adage. You might have heard it before. I heard it first from filmmaker Jim Jarmusch. Cheap, fast, or good, you can pick two. If it's cheap and fast, it's not going to be good. If it's fast and good, it's not going to be cheap, etc. Now, I think I've said before on some occasions that I've essentially tried to make a career out of disproving this. That said, it's for the most part very true. The reality is that every decision that you make in the filmmaking process, particularly in the prep process, every decision that you make, you are choosing between either more time or more money. So I'll give you an example. As I covered in episode 4 on hiring casting director Rachel Meyer, that decision was born of the realization that the casting process was going to be far, far too demanding for me to just tackle alone among the many other tasks that I was going to have to take on. So as I looked at it a little closer over time and realized that something like casting through Craigslist was not going to be as viable an option as I had thought based on previous conceptions. And the fact that I'm just not super tapped into the local acting community, what I kind of realized was that there was no harm in at least looking around for a possible casting director, getting some rate estimates, getting an idea for what they would bring to the process. So that decision ultimately led me to casting director Rachel Meyer, which was an extra expenditure. In that episode, I did say that Rachel Meyer's rate lent a pretty significant percentage increase to the overall budget, but the time it saved me in having to field all of these emails, organize that entire process, relaying information back and forth with agencies, with individual unrepresented actors, with the union, things like that, it was well worth the relatively small expense in the grand scheme of things that was incurred in hiring Rachel on. And she also happened to be a rock star caliber at what she did, which is important when you're looking at spending money to save yourself time. You want people who will really, really ultimately save you time. That was really a great example of this philosophy at play. And all the while you're considering balancing time and money, I highly recommend, and I will keep coming back to this throughout the season, but I highly recommend also keeping your vision central to every decision. When I weigh the mechanisms with which I am able to save money, I also have to be weighing, is this going to compromise the final vision of the film? Is this decision that I am making to save money going to reflect on the screen? Is it going to compromise the overall aesthetic of the movie? Is it going to compromise performances? Is it going to compromise crew dynamics? So those are important things to weigh when you're looking to save money. When you're looking to save time, you have to be also asking yourself the same exact questions. Is speeding through this going to compromise the end output? So keeping the vision central is really, really crucial. Otherwise, you'll start making a bunch of flagrant decisions, as I did on my first feature, Painted City, where things that I employed to save time or to save money invariably ended up manifesting as shortcomings on the screen. And, you know, in some cases from an audio perspective, in some cases from a visual perspective, in all cases they compromised the integrity of the final film. And those are things that you really, really, really want to avoid while making decisions about time and money. But throughout that decision-making process, really, really keep at the center of your mind that time and money on a film shoot particularly are always, always related. If you decide to cut corners with either, you will have more of the other. That's just how it works. So now I'm going to move into something a little bit more specific. I want to talk a little bit about organization. Organization, especially on this budget, on a micro budget, organization is absolutely crucial. Good organization, well thought out organization is absolutely crucial. And I have heard many a horror story from larger budget productions. I've even experienced this on some level. On larger budget productions where there's a little bit of financial flexibility, I think that organization can kind of fall by the wayside in some ways because there's money there to kind of pick up the slack. Like you can throw more money into solving problems. So you're the level to which you're organized to avert certain problems kind of becomes a point of slack. In the case of how I approach organization, I try to be as meticulous and detailed as possible. Now, I am a creative person by nature, so meticulousness and detail with things like numbers and documents and sheets and folders isn't necessarily my default position. Now, I can be very meticulous and detailed, sometimes to a fault, with creative endeavors, with the sort of minutia of executing a creative vision. But in terms of organization for workflow and organization for the sake of logistics, that's not really my default position. But I have to really force myself as much as possible and be okay and forgive myself for the times when I'm not as meticulous as possible, but really, 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 really force myself to be as meticulous as possible, as much as possible. So I'll use the example. I really had to rain down on myself with the budget. I really, really, really had to just grind my heels into the ground and ensure that every time something changed, whether for better or worse, whether a cost was added or a cost was subtracted, I really, really, really had to emphasize the importance to myself that I always revisit the budget and always reflect whatever that update was in the budget document. That was crucial for me to always have an at-a-glance look of where I was at, and that would allow me to compensate in other areas on the budget. That would just give me a good 30,000-foot view of whatever I was working with from a financial perspective. And being very trained in that approach over time allowed me to keep logistical elements like that in mind and know that that level of discipline would reflect throughout the rest of the pre-production process. So constantly updating the budget served as kind of a good reminder that I should be constantly updating other things and focusing on detailed record keeping. That sort of feeds into the next subtopic of organization, which is keeping records. And I don't just mean, saving your receipts out of order in a jumbled, paper folder in a desk drawer that you'll never look at again, though saving receipts is absolutely imperative for things like taxes and for things like running returns later on or whatever the case may be. Keeping records goes far beyond that. Keeping records relates to how you manage your email inbox and how you manage the many documents that you're going to have to be responsible for on a film production, and overall additional logistical questions that come into play. So I highly, highly recommend, as a general strategy, employing folders wherever folders are available, digital folders particularly in this instance. So, for instance, one thing that I did with my email when immediately upon beginning pre-production on counterintelligence was I began a folder for counterintelligence in my Gmail account with subfolders for different categories. So there was a subfolder for cast, there was a subfolder for crew, there was a subfolder for documentation, there was a subfolder for receipts, etc. And upon receiving any emails of these types or beginning any correspondence of these types, I would add those correspondence or random emails into those associated folders. And that kind of cleared my head quite a bit down the line when I, quickly needed to call something into question or, check a record on something. Oftentimes you'll get an email from one crew member asking, a question about your documents or your interactions with another crew member, and quickly you can resort back to whatever folder is necessary to find that answer. Or you'll get certain facets of production like SAG, for instance, or whoever your crew member is working with SAG, asking about things like insurance. So that would go into documentation, and then you can revisit the documentation folder to find the answers on insurance for SAG. So folders are absolutely crucial, and I did the same in Google Drive, which is where I house the vast majority of documents related to the film. I find Google Drive to be an awesome tool that's accessible pretty much everywhere. I'm sure a lot of you use it, so I'm not going to belabor Google Drive as an explanation here. I also link to Google Drive and Google Sheets in the toolkit at showhawk.com/makethismovie, the free toolkit, with explanations on how specifically I used it. But one thing that I don't cover there or in previous episodes is my folder structure. So I created a CI or counterintelligence folder in my Google Drive, which housed, the vast majority of documents like at the beginning, scripts, storyboards, shot lists, things like that. And then I compartmentalized subfolders for things like shot lists and was able to sort of move things to their specific homes, including again, insurance documents, SAG documents, contracts with cast and crew, and then, early schedules. There was a whole budget folder for the varying states of the budget and different iterations of the budget. So that's a great way to use Google Drive, similar to email, to kind of compartmentalize all that information and make it at a glance easy to find and easily accessible. Some other helpful tools that I used for counterintelligence were Evernote, which I'm actually using right now to review the notes for this episode. And Evernote is really, really helpful for me. It works really well with my brain. I know that my Showhawk co-founder, Mike, isn't a huge fan of it. I guess, it doesn't work for everybody. I know a couple people who are really averse to it. I used to be the type of person that had color-coded notebooks for different projects or different aspects of my life, and I would carry them around, and it became heavy and all this stuff. I was really, really, really resistant to adopting Evernote as a digital alternative to this. And when I invariably cracked the code of how Evernote works, it just fit perfectly with my MO, which is it organizes different notebooks for you. So you create different notebooks on different topics for different projects, for different ideas, for ongoing themes. And I really quickly took to it. And within those notebooks, you can create an unlimited amount of notes that are varying in their substance, and you can assign those notes to different notebooks as you see fit. So I had an ongoing counterintelligence notebook where I would put everything from script notes to later on editing notes. I also did very early drafts of the schedule and things like that in there. Any kinds of lists that I needed, lists of things to do, lists of things to get, lists of who to talk to. Those I mostly got transcribed into Evernote, and that became kind of a go-to first step place for organization. So that's Evernote, and then the other tool that I use pretty frequently is Trello. Trello is a fantastic resource, and it's not for everybody again, but it's similar to having bulletin boards with different notes on them, and within those notes you can put checklists, you can put tasks, you can put descriptions, you can put whatever. How I like to use Trello is almost lining up different bulletin boards next to each other and moving cards between them as they get completed, sort of in the traditional Scrum process, which I'll let you look up and I can link to it in the show notes. But Scrum is what's often used in the software and coding industries to sort of move tasks through different phases of completion, and that's sort of how I use Trello. But Trello is really good because you can include in cards, you can include things like checklists, you can include specific notes to specific people. You can create groups and invite different users to Trello so they can check off their different tasks. So Trello is a really fantastic tool. Again, not for everybody, much like Evernote, but I would highly, highly recommend it, especially for organization of multitasked events and jobs like making a film where there are so many plates being juggled at the same time that you can sort of account for those plates on different boards and see them through to execution in a detailed way. And then the other aspect of organization that I want to cover here is making informed estimates in terms of costs, and not shooting from the hip is super important. So for that, I'll resort back to an example that I covered earlier on in the budgeting episode, and that example involves hard drives. Early on, I had sort of made some uneducated assumptions about how much we would be spending on hard drives, and those assumptions turned out to be vastly incorrect. I came in largely underestimating what hard drives would cost for the production, and that was a huge ding at the end of the day. That added quite a bit to the budget, as I've covered before. So making informed estimates and being realistic and doing research where you can. That was a question that could have so easily been answered by 15 minutes of research, but I made assumptions, and that was a huge mistake. So also in terms of making informed estimations, really do your research on cast and crew fees to ensure that you don't get blindsided with somebody who's asking a lot, and then you have to go through the rigmarole of wondering, like, are they asking too much? Should I negotiate? When can I negotiate? How do I negotiate? Get a feel for what the industry averages are out there for different people in different job descriptions. Get a feel for what kind of the median cost for those collaborators is. And when you're budgeting, make your estimations based on that research, not based on what you think might be an appropriate rate. Because more often than not, you'll either undershoot or overshoot. And overshooting is great because then you invariably come in under budget, but you're more likely to undershoot and just assume, well, maybe this person will like the project so much they won't take as much money as they ordinarily would. That is not a strategy. I really, truly believe the answers are out there. You just need to find them. And akin to that, I would also say researching gear lists, and I covered this as well, but asking your relevant crew for those gear lists, what else they'll need to accomplish the task of making your film as best they possibly can. Remember, I referenced the bare bones budget, which is their list of things, the bare minimum things that they'll need to accomplish the task of making, this film the best it can be under those constraints, or the sugar and spice budget, or the sugar and spice budget, which is their best possible scenario from a budget perspective of what they'll need. And I cannot recommend highly enough provoking your crew members, your key crew members, for both of those lists and getting both estimates and trying to land somewhere in the middle. This is how you create educated financial estimations on what the film is going to cost you. And frankly, I highly recommend you do this earlier than I did it. I highly recommend that you jump in as soon as possible, even before, in many cases, before you greenlight your project. Since doing counterintelligence and falling on my face and learning some of the harder lessons, I've contemplated sort of like what my next projects are going to be. And I've got some different story ideas and, all that stuff that we filmmakers do. But I've been dissuaded from approaching many of them because I've really dove into some of the lessons that I learned on counterintelligence, things that blindsided me in sort of prepping for these hypothetical projects and quickly realizing that this is going to get out of hand really fast if I want to do it right. And it's going to end up costing, a lot more than I need it to cost at this point. Might be different when I'm, eventually ready, but at this point, it's completely unfeasible. So really, before you even dive into your film or to even greenlighting for pre-production, get a good budget together. And don't skimp on your organization, and don't skimp on your estimates for how much things should cost. And then the final thing with organization is don't get too intimidated. Just really don't get too intimidated by all this. I know it sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. I'm not going to sit here and bullshit you. I know it's a lot of work, and setting up these kind of foundational tools can seem like a lot, and there's a lot of learning curves involved, particularly once you start dealing with money. It's really easy to get overwhelmed and really intimidated and back off from the process. But this is how you learn. You know, if you get intimidated easily by things and that causes you to step away from doing them instead of walking head on into them, you're never really going to grow. Like, you're never really going to evolve as an artist or really as a person. So that carries really heavily also into not getting too intimidated when you're self-financing a project. Self-financing is, as I covered in the funding episode in some great detail, self-financing is extremely, I would say painful at certain points. And it's easy to want to walk away, like to feel like you've gone too far and you've made too many mistakes already to really sell it. But you have to stick with it. And self-financing can also be really freeing, and it can be very gratifying. As I've said, I don't regret self-financing counterintelligence in the least for all the struggles and hardships that it resulted in. I still really think that it was one of the best decisions I ever made. If you are making intelligent estimates, if you're keeping your records, if you're being meticulous and detailed, the rest should kind of fall into place with regards to the money. And ultimately, what that should result in, irrelevant of where the money's coming from, is not disrespecting it. Always respect the money. Always respect the money involved, especially at early stages when you're sort of building your career, making micro-budget work, making just low-budget work. There is absolutely no glamour. And I repeat, there is absolutely no glamour in spending too much money or too much time or wasting resources. If it's really interesting, if you look at a lot of the filmmakers from, say, the 1970s who were sort of known for going well over schedule and well over budget, what happened is they got older. If you look at their careers now, they tend to be working on budget and under schedule. It's a really interesting phenomena. They came to respect the money. And I highly recommend that you don't wait until you're 70 years old to learn that lesson. Start your career off right in that regard. So let's move on. The next thing that I want to cover is communication. And this is undeniably paramount in the filmmaking process. You are going to be, it is a team sport. As many have said, filmmaking is a team sport, and you have to be okay not only with collaboration, but clear communication, comfortable communication, and genuine communication with those who are, sharing the stage with you, with those who are helping bring your vision to life or bring a vision to life. Communication is key. And so I want to talk about first, with regards to communication, getting comfortable communicating with your peers. It seems really self-explanatory, but it's amazing how many people I see at the highest levels of the game who have no comfort communicating with their peers or with anyone for that matter. They're sort of almost like antisocial and can be really rude or dismissive. But ultimately, filmmaking is a very social activity. And there are questions to answer. There are questions to ask. None of them are stupid because you want to do it right. So getting comfortable asking those questions and getting comfortable maintaining composure, answering those questions, and viewing other people's questions as coming from the right place is really, really, really valuable. I think that you need to really engage a side of yourself that might not come easily. Artists tend to be really impatient people, especially in the short term. To be a good communicator, you have to kind of sacrifice that and play the long game. Now, don't get me wrong. When you're making a film, you got shit to do. We all got shit to do. There's a lot to be crossed off of the list on any given day, even before a camera shows up on set, or before a set is even selected. There's a lot to be done, but getting, comfortable sort of seeing through the constant state of scatterbrainness and urgency and everything has to happen now, getting comfortable getting past that and really taking one thing at a time and communicating calmly and patiently with your peers is really important. And then another sort of philosophy that I carry in every aspect of my life, sometimes to the detriment of certain interactions, is I really, really, truly believe that over communication is better than under communication. You want to be detailed in how you communicate with your peers, with strangers, with the people who you have relationships with outside of your film while you're making your film, because it is a very stressful time. Over communicating can be, I think, really beneficial. Being very transparent, very honest, urging anyone in your midst to be very transparent and honest and to over communicate their feelings on a situation. And that also, yes, includes your peers. Being very over communicative often pays in dividends, I think. Making what that really reflects is an environment where everyone feels comfortable talking to each other, and there's no spite, there's no malice, there's no harbored ill will between people, because everyone feels comfortable bringing what they have to the table. And no one's feelings are disregarded in that process. And everyone ultimately from that feels safe, and I think that just leads to a better situation. And really over-communicating your own position and your own vision, and asking, does this make sense? Whether it be with your DP, setting up storyboards and shot lists and things like that. Does this make sense? When we get to this day, does this flow of things make sense? And giving them an avenue to sort of object and being receptive to that rejection and then working out a proper solution is really, really important. So yeah, over-communication is very, very helpful, particularly before cameras roll. And in addition to that, a big part of communication, I think, as well, is knowing when to assert and when to listen. This is sort of a well-honed skill over time, and admittedly, I don't know really anybody who's mastered this. I can't really think of anyone offhand that I know who's mastered this. We as human beings have, in my belief, and I think a lot of people's belief, we have an overwhelming need to be heard. We really want to be heard. We want to be listened to. We want to know that our voice is being heard and taken in, and what we have to say is really being ingested by the person that we're talking to. And it's on you as the leader of a team making a film. It is on you to know when to listen, when to let people feel heard, you always want to make people feel heard, but it's also on you to know when to assert and when to say, this is how we're doing things. And I can't tell you specifically how to do that because it's going to vary based on every situation, every decision you make, and every conversation that you're having, and every crew member and cast member that you work with. There are a lot of subjective variables in this equation, but knowing when to assert and when to listen is something that you want to keep really at the forefront of your mind when communicating with those around you. You have to be able to also, in that process, ascertain whether or not issues are real. Because, as I said before, we do have a baked-in kind of sense of urgency in this industry. If you've ever been on a large set, I find one of the funniest things about large, quote-unquote, professional sets, one of my sort of side humorous commentaries, I guess, is I find it hilarious that everyone is always walking around like the sky is falling. You've got 60 people there, and everyone that approaches you, or approaches anyone for that matter, is approaching with this sort of rapidly pulsing heart, as though whatever this decision is going to topple the world and the entire production is going to fall apart. And, I've always thought it would be really funny to, have an interaction like that and have the answer just be like, just get fucking bagels. Like, we don't need anything, just get bagels. That's the sort of sense of urgency that everyone has on every matter. And sometimes you really, really have to be diligent about, in the heat of the moment, and when things do feel like they're moving too quick, or when they are actually moving too quick, you really have to be diligent about ascertaining what the real importance of an issue is in that given situation and approaching it accordingly. And in that process, also as the leader, you can't really be afraid to have a will in the situation. You don't want to impose that will in an authoritarian way. I really, truly am not a believer in that. I don't think that you get anywhere from that. I have had my bouts of that in the past, I'll say. And I can honestly say that being respectful and being nice and communicative and open, friendly, fun, a pleasure to be around as much as possible gets you way more than, asserting your will in an unfair way. But it is okay to have a will. People are looking to you for that vision. You have to really be able to step up and not be super subjective on certain things. Actors love to know what you think most of the time. Crew members want to know where they're supposed to stand, what they're supposed to be capturing. You need to be available to deliver that information in a respectful way, but you have to have a will in certain regards. So don't forget that. And then digital communication is also very key. Don't let yourself get behind. Behind usually means you got overwhelmed. Take, for instance, on this film, the pre-production processes of SAG, payroll, and insurance. That sort of trifecta of processes that I underwent on counterintelligence overwhelmed me. It was one of the only times in pre-production that I can honestly, truly say that I was completely overwhelmed, because they all depended on each other and they all had to happen in a certain timely fashion, and I had attempted none of them myself in the past. So I was completely at the will of whatever new information came out from hour to hour. And I think overall those processes took maybe a few weeks. But happening all at the same time and having to respond to everything promptly became a huge weight for me to kind of carry around, and it really put me in a negative headspace for quite a bit. Well, worthwhile, but just to say that a lot of that type of experience that type of overwhelm can result in procrastinating, because you're too nervous to make a decision, or you're too overwhelmed to feel like you're making an educated decision. Don't procrastinate. Stay on top of it. It is okay to step away for a second, but stay on top of it. It's really, really important. And communicate clearly through those processes. If via email, communicate very clearly with the people that you're emailing with any questions you have, concerns you have, and be respectful and be nice in that communication digitally. It's really easy to come across as curt and rude in emails and texts, which you'll be sending a lot of throughout the process. It's really easy to come across as curt and rude through those written means of communication. Do your absolute best to go out of your way, even if it just means including a smiley face at the end. I know it sounds ridiculous, at the end of a text, or an emoji or something at the end of a text or an email, indicating that you are not approaching this mode of communication in a overworked, overwhelmed, or overly curt or dismissive way. It goes a long way. The last point on communication is listening to criticism. If you're the creative type, which I'm assuming you are listening to this, some part of your stomach twisted or your heart sunk for a second when I said listen to criticism. But in fact, you shouldn't just be listening to criticism. You should be begging for it. As we covered in the hiring episode where I brought Tim aboard, you should be begging people for their honest opinion. And you need to be able to parse through the difference between an honest opinion and a flagrant, disrespectful criticism. There's an important distinction to be made there. You need to understand the difference between a constructive bit of criticism and a piece of criticism that comes from a more oppressive standpoint. And the sooner that you can figure out the difference between those two things, which really, it's a much more objective thing than a lot of us like to think, because we're artists, we're sensitive. It's easy to hurt our feelings. It's easy to get us, stirred up. And there's no shame in that. That's just the reality of who a lot of us are. It's kind of a weird chicken and egg thing. But you should be really, at the end of the day, begging for people to kind of give you their open input and criticism to allow the production to work better, to allow the artistic vision to be better, and to allow yourself to truly grow and evolve as both an artist and as a pragmatist who has to bring a project together. Do keep in mind that as the leader of this project, you have the last right of refusal. So there's nothing anyone can ever say to you as the leader of the project, and this isn't an ego thing, this is just a reality of the situation. You're the one hiring people, you're the one setting it up, it's your vision that's being executed. Again, don't let your ego get in the way, but always be free to remind yourself, in the face of criticism, you have the last right of refusal. You are the last person on the chain to be able to say yes, no, I don't think this is how we're going to go with it, or that's a great idea, thank you, I'm going to move forward with that. You're the end of the line. You get to dictate the course of this. That said, with that in mind, you have to be open. So now I want to move on to negotiation. And in negotiation, which is something that we didn't really cover in great depth in the season, but undoubtedly it is something that you're going to have to deal with in the filmmaking process. All of the rules of communication that I listed previously, all of them apply. They are all applicable to negotiation. Knowing when to listen, knowing when to assert yourself, not being overly assertive, not being rude, being respectful, asking lots of questions, over-communicating to a certain point does also apply, and getting comfortable and listening to criticism, all of this applies to negotiation. What I would recommend with negotiation, I would recommend reading a book by a gentleman named Chris Voss. I read it fairly recently on my Showhawk co-founder Mike's his recommendation. The book is by Chris Voss, and it's called Never Split the Difference. And it's an amazing book about sort of the art and, to some extent, science of negotiation, written by a former hostage negotiator. He negotiated hostages out of the hands of everyone from radical terrorists to bank thieves to foreign governments, everything. And his testimonies and the way that he honed it as an art are fascinating and super compelling. I can't recommend the book enough. Never Split the Difference, it's called. And a few of the key components that he brings up in successful negotiation are engaging empathy, listening to the other party's needs to assess before asserting your own, and reflecting back. And I want to cover those really quickly. So engaging empathy, it's fairly clear. You walk into any negotiation of any kind, be it over price, be it over approach on set, be it, whatever the case may be, walk into any negotiation empathetic of the fact that the person that you are speaking with and trying to find a better outcome with, they don't think like you do. They think like they do. They're not processing the situation through the same lens that you are. They're processing the situation through their own lens. You have to be open to that and realizing that the rest of the world doesn't communicate the way that you do or think the way that you do. So you have to find out how they're thinking and why they're thinking that way. And to do that, you have to listen to their needs. You have to ask about their needs. Ask all these questions. Get to the bottom of why they think whatever decision they're lobbying for, why they think that their proposed rate, or why they think that their proposed approach is the best way. Ask them repeatedly, and politely. Be open. Once you have sort of ascertained all these answers, then reflect them back to them. What I'm getting from this is that you want these things. Am I understanding correctly? This is kind of where I hear that you're coming from, and they may correct you or they may just affirm what you said. From there, you can start making solid decisions. From there, you can start working towards a compromise. But you have to do those things in communicating, even in the heat of really stressful moments in either prep or production or whatever, with collaborators early on, again, when you're negotiating rates, be it with crew members, cast members. Locations are a really good example of this because most of the time they don't know what it's like to have a film, shoot at their space. So you need to be really open to all of their questions and concerns that they might have and acknowledge those questions and concerns before trying to move forward to land on a rate or a time or whatever the case may be. And ultimately with all of this, and this isn't, from the book, this is just sort of something that I take to heart, and I mentioned it previously in just the general communications, but you do catch more bees with honey. Being communicatively oppressive, it really wins for no one. People will, this is from the book, but people will say yes and often mean no. And they'll do it just to get you to shut up or just to get you to leave them alone. A lot of people, I would argue most people, are fairly non-confrontational. So if you bombard them with confrontationalism, they'll appease you just to appease you. And the moment it's time to follow up, they either won't respond or they'll deflect or whatever. So you really, really have to meet people where they are. And to do that, you have to be approachable and polite. And the last kind of note on negotiation that I would keep, thoroughly in mind throughout any negotiation process, no one is going to make a decision or take an action that they don't personally find appealing or beneficial. It's just a reality of the world. Doesn't mean we're all utilitarians sort of wandering aimlessly through the universe looking for a fix. What it means, though, is that it's relatively impossible to convince somebody that something is beneficial to them if they are truly sold on the fact that it is not before you even walk in the room or early on in your communication. So if you look at it through the lens of investing money in a project or backing a project or a potential collaborator taking a job or role, no potential collaborator is going to take a job with you if they don't think that taking that job will benefit them in some way, even if it's only the experience. Like if you look at Tim taking the job on some level because he was just curious if we could pull it off in 7 days. On some level, he was just curious, how that process would look, and he was willing to kind of go through it just to see. And certainly there were other reasons that he took the job. I'm sure, I hope, but that was beneficial to him. That was something that he could see long-term growth from, I guess. But also with investors or backers. No investor is going to put money into your project, and no backer on, crowdfunding will back your project unless they see some personal silver lining, some personal benefit, some downstream benefit, a light at the end of the tunnel that they can really rely on. And in film investing and in film backing, unfortunately, we're relegated to being one of the most volatile and dangerous investments for an investor. So what are the benefits for that investor? Is your film related to a cause that they, align with in a really profound way? Or is your film on a theme that they have personal experience with that matters to them? These are the types of things that you want to iron out because, again, no one does things that don't appeal to them. No one does things that they don't think will have a benefit to them in the long run in some way. Next, I want to talk about time management. This is a really still sort of sensitive subject for me because I'm always sort of working towards mastering it. I don't think it's specific to creative people, but I do know that most of the creative people I know struggle with time management on some level. I think there's something about that sort of abstract thinking mind drawing, a host of odd conclusions and interpretations from thin air and centering them around one piece of artistic expression that just doesn't really lend itself to being good at time management. I don't know why, but I have observed it as a reality of the creative world. There are exceptions. I have a specific experience with this on counterintelligence because while making the film, I was balancing a full-time job, which I was, I had to prioritize because it's very important. And in balancing that job and making the film, I had to still be able to concentrate on the tasks at hand, whether it be for pre-production, production, or post. And how that manifested for me and how I found it most achievable to manage my time was by condensing tasks. I tend to make lists of the tasks that I have to accomplish in a given day. I try to keep those lists as short as possible. But I try to make lists of the tasks that I have to accomplish on a given day. That's not abnormal. What I do in addition to making those lists is I add a parenthetical of how much time each task will take. And to accomplish this, I have to be brutally honest with myself. What's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? And then I generally gear somewhere in the middle. So it'll be such and such task will take an hour and a half. Such and such task will take 15 minutes. Such and such task will take 4 hours. And that's how I sort of compile my list of stuff to do in a given day. You can extend this out to weeks, and you can even extend this out to month-long projects. But this is how I approach it, and that's how I sort of condense. What I mean by condensing tasks, I break larger tasks into micro tasks, and then I break down how long each of those micro tasks will take, and that sort of ripples out into how long the master task will take. In addition to balancing the full-time job, I made sure to immediately upon locking the film schedule, I plan my time off as far out as possible so as not to throw any wrenches in the motor at work. And just to have it off my back and not have to worry about it later on. That was another reason that I scheduled the film to shoot on weekends, because it was easier for me, honestly. I was a little more clear of mind. I didn't want to go from, at that point, I worked 4/10s, so I didn't want to go from a 10-hour day at my day job and jump into a 10-hour shoot, which wouldn't always have even been possible. But I just didn't. I wanted to avoid it. I wanted to give myself some mental free space to be able to do it. That's really how I kind of, in short part, how I kind of balanced the process of time management. And then in addition, I want to talk a little bit about something I've already covered here, which is procrastination in a general sense, not just in the sense of, email correspondence, but in a more general sense. I have a history with this. I procrastinated too much on counterintelligence, but yet I would say that I did it less than I have done in the past. It's an ongoing evolution. It's an ongoing journey to sort of get past this bad tendency. But what I found, particularly on this film, because I was really paying close attention to it and that tendency, when I procrastinated, it was mostly because I had to prioritize and reprioritize over and over with things like the SAG insurance and payroll trifecta, where the mileposts were unclear to me and they were ever changing every day with every email, sometimes hour to hour, and that would make me kind of procrastinate completing certain tasks because I wasn't really sure where or when it was going to end. Good planning sort of comes into play here. If you can plan to specific milestones, you can really avoid procrastination. If you have specific dates that you need to get certain things done to appease certain people or parts of the process, that's a great way to avoid procrastination, especially under those conditions. As I said, I did it most when the milestones weren't clear. Also, sort of forgiving yourself. Some things are okay to procrastinate. You just have to know what they are, and you have to be realistic about what they are. For instance, a lot of times I'll procrastinate a task that somewhere in the back of my mind, I know I can get done in 15 minutes. The problem with procrastinating a task for 3 weeks that you can get done in 15 minutes is by the time you get to the point where you have to execute it in 15 minutes or 16 minutes before it needs to be delivered or done or whatever, you've got 3 weeks worth of other tasks to accomplish. So being realistic up front about this seems like something I'm going to want to procrastinate. Why is that? Probably because I can get it done really quickly. So I can either decide to get it done really quickly right now, or I can add it to a list and keep it at the forefront of my mind and know that at some point I'm going to have to do this in 15 minutes, preferably not 16 minutes before it's due. And if I do decide to do it 16 minutes before it's due, I need to dedicate the next 3 weeks to clearing the way for me to have that free 16 minutes, preferably make it 20. But have that free, 20 minutes to get that task done with a few less worries. So procrastination no longer feels like you're completely dropping the ball and under the gun on every single decision that you're making. Never procrastinate scheduling, crewing up, or gear arrangements. If you procrastinate those 3 things, what you'll end up with is A, spending more money than you intended, B, people not knowing where to go or when to go, which can result in people not even signing on to the project, or can result in serious hurdles for later. Your schedule is going to be a lot more hodgepodge if you don't come to the game with it ready. And gear arrangements, I think I've covered it enough. Not planning far enough in advance and procrastinating, you'll just get blindsided. You'll get blindsided in terms of costs. So don't procrastinate those 3 things under any circumstances. Always ask collaborators, what's the latest I can get this to you? That was something that I began to adopt that really saved me from the heartache of that SAG, insurance, and payroll trifecta. I began to ask via email, either with vendors or with my collaborators. If I was emailed with a request to deliver something, do something, sign something, more often than not, after a little while, I would begin emailing back, what's the latest that I can get this to you? And if they said, I need it in an hour, then I knew that had to be moved up the list. If they said no, a lot of times they would say, no rush. No rush. Get this to me whenever you can. Here's what else hinges on it. And based on what they said hinges on it, I could decide, okay, this is something I need to get done, or okay, this can wait. I can knock out these other 3 things and not get so stressed or blindsided by this. I can focus on these other 3 things and come back to this when I'm ready, which could be later today, it could be tomorrow, it could be next week. So that's a really good tool. Asking, what's the latest I can get this to you, and provoking that answer from the person you're working with. The final kind of time management piece that is also inevitable and I think really important is avoiding burnout. And I got to be real with you, I'm about as traditional a workaholic as anyone could know. I like to say I'm a recovering workaholic, though it's not always true. It's certainly not true at this given moment. One solution that I found while making counterintelligence, and this was new to me, and I have had to remind myself of this and readopt it over and over, and I wouldn't trade this realization for the world. At certain points, when things got really heated, and I really just felt like the world was falling on me, and I was totally underwater, and I just needed to get this done. Whatever it was, I just needed to get all these things done, and it just seemed like too much, and I was going crazy. I would step away. I would commit, once that feeling of the sky falling and the world bearing down on me began to suffocate me, that was my cue to say, I'm going to take the night off. I'm going to go home, I'm going to watch TV, I'm going to go for a nice walk with my girlfriend, we're going to chat, we're going to go to dinner, we'll go grab a drink, whatever the case may be. I stepped away. And I got out of sight, out of mind. And what that gave me, it would avert burnout, because by the next day I felt more relaxed, more rejuvenated, and frankly I just got more done better the next day than I would have if I would have just shoehorned everything in. Now that's not always doable, but knowing when it is and adopting that can really avert burnout, and I highly recommend it, especially on a micro budget, because shit's going to get stressful. You really have to combat the need to do this now impulse. It's super crucial that you combat that at every step of the way and avoid that kind of death trap of this industry as a whole. So the final topic that I want to cover in any depth here is honesty. It's a part of communication. It's a part of negotiation. It's really a part of the entire filmmaking process. But why I wanted to focus on it here is I just don't think it gets talked about in the filmmaking world enough. Why honesty is so important. Honesty with the relationships that you build with collaborators, honesty with the strangers, vendors that you work with, people providing food, honesty with location managers, honesty with location owners, honesty with your cast, honesty at every step of the way. You can't underrate it. I know I've worked with and I've met many people in this field who have sort of made careers out of half truths, and that's not to denigrate anyone specifically, but I've observed it quite heavily, and I think that a lot of it comes from the sort of rampant level of insecurity in this industry. Everyone, we all have our insecurities. Artists have them in multitudes, and I think that the result of that is there can be borderline con artists among us, and I try to put as much focus on being an honest member of this community as possible. So first and foremost, to be honest with others, you have to be honest with yourself. Be honest about the requirements of a project. Be honest about what the scheduling needs for a project are. Be honest about your strengths and weaknesses. That one is extremely hard because our tendency is to just adopt especially on a micro budget level, especially when, you're sort of a filmmaking product of the late 20th and 21st century where you've had all the tools available to you your whole life. We have a tendency of saying, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that, I can do all these tasks, I know how to do that, I can do that, I can do that, we'll save money, we'll save time, I can do that, I can do that. And what happens when you say I can do that so many times is that you have so much shit to do that things begin to fall by the wayside and other people begin to kind of, inadvertently suffer for it. So be honest about your strengths and weaknesses. And if you're being honest about your strengths, be honest about, how many strengths you're willing to submit to a certain part of the process. And then in addition, be honest about outside limitations. Be honest about, what the limitations of a location are. Don't try to shoehorn something in if you only think it's going to half work. It doesn't work that way. You have to be really honest. And you have to be honest with the outside limitations on yourself as well. Be honest about having a day job and how you're going to be able to work around that. Be honest about how to get out of social engagements without really hurting the people in your life while you're trying to get this film done. Be honest about all these things and how you're going to tackle them. And then in addition, like I've said, be honest with your collaborators. Be honest with your backers and financiers. Be honest about the risks. Be honest also about the potential rewards, and be honest about why you're raising the amount of money that you want to raise. Make sure that you're raising the appropriate amount of money, obviously, to accommodate for that post budget and to accommodate for that marketing budget, as Mike covered in the previous episode, and be honest about why those dollars are there. It'll instill more confidence, and it'll form a better rapport and relationship in the long run. Just make sure that no one can accuse you of swindling. That's really important. That's really what all this honesty with others kind of boils down to. You don't want anyone to ever be able to turn to you and say, that guy's got, nefarious intent in the way that he approaches these negotiations and interactions, transactions, whatever the case may be. Don't ever put yourself in that position to be regarded as that person, because frankly, that person sucks. And if enough people are saying it, sorry, it's probably true. And then ultimately, be honest as a storyteller. Maintain a consistent eye on what you're making and be honest about whether it's coming together or not. You have to be true to the story at all times. You have to, and this comes back to the very beginning, keeping the vision central. You have to be honest with your vision. Lastly, with honesty, define what enough means from the beginning. There's always a temptation to do more and more. Set your price, so to speak, financially and personally. Know when enough is enough, what does enough look like, how do we get to enough, and how do we avoid too much or too little. Now that we've covered all the topics in a great deal of depth, I just want to cover some quick resources here that I think will help you navigate this process even further. I will be linking to all of these resources in the show notes and on the associated blog post for this episode. They come in the form of books and podcasts for the most part, and I highly recommend you look into all of them. as early as possible in your filmmaking process. If you're approaching these resources before even writing, that would be ideal. But if you are at some other stage, it's never too late. I really do think that they'll heavily inform the early phases, particularly of making your film. So the first resource that I want to bring up is the book Independent Ed. This is the book that, frankly, lit a fire under my ass to make counterintelligence to begin with. I had been floundering quite a bit and trying to figure out what I was going to do next in terms of feature film project. This was the book that really inspired me to just jump off the cliff and self-finance and bring the film to life financially on my own, and to undertake this task that I from a financial perspective, had never undertaken before. Independent Ed is written by Edward Burns. You may know him as an actor, you may know him as a director, screenwriter, or all of the above. It tells the story, it tracks the story of his sort of mythic stature in the independent film world of the 90s going into the early 2000s, and then a period where his career took a bit of a lull, and how he was able to resurge and resurface his career making micro-budget films. And he outlines the specific details of those processes within the pages of this book. It is outstanding. It's a fun read. It reads like, a New York neighborhood dude telling you stories on a bar stool. But the details are crucial, and you will walk away inspired. I can guarantee you will walk away inspired to make your film. So that's Independent Ed, link in the show notes. The next book that I highly recommend reading as early as possible, though it focuses on the tail end of the process. You want to be able to read this book to plan accordingly for that end, beginning with the end in mind, so to speak. The book that I want to recommend is John Reese's Think Outside the Box Office. That's Think Outside the Box Office by John Reese, also linked in the show notes. This book was an absolute game changer. It gave me the first insights I ever had into direct distribution and different hybrid forms of that, how to get a film out in the marketplace in the 21st century. It was my first real exposure to that, and I think it was a lot of people's first real exposure to that imprint. John Reese is a filmmaker himself and now a consultant. I had the pleasure of talking to him on the phone briefly about counterintelligence a few months ago. He's an extremely knowledgeable guy, and the book that he gave us with Think Outside the Box Office is essentially a 21st century manual for getting films out into the world under what are now less new circumstances, but this is the landscape that we're all dealing with, and this book will give you line item by line item what to expect. Now, some of it is a bit dated and antiquated, but I'll also link to John Reese's blog for some updated resources and things like that he's always including on there. So that's Think Outside the Box Office. Next resource that I will link to this is a long title, but it's written by a fellow Portlander and Film Trooper podcast host, Scott McMahon. It is his book, How to Make and Sell Your Film Online and Survive the Hollywood Implosion While Doing It. No festivals, no distributors, no budget, no problem. This book was really cool. And I give mad props to Scott, who I recently met, who is as nice of a guy as his podcast would lead you to believe. I highly recommend you visit his website, filmtrooper.com. Will also be listed in the show notes, where you can actually find more stuff like this, his podcasts, blog posts, and other links to his book. This book tells the story of how Scott produced a $500 feature film on his own, obviously, and put it online and made it available and distributed it and sold it, and how that worked out and what exactly he did to facilitate all that. It's a really neat story, and I highly recommend checking the book out. It's really good. The next book that I want to cover, we actually have a blog post about this on Showhawk that my co-founder Mike wrote, and I will link to that as well. But this book is called Creativity Inc., and it's by Ed Catmull. Ed Catmull is the co-founder of Pixar. And in Creativity Inc., Ed discusses in depth the inner workings of Pixar, which is, I think most of us would agree, has a pretty phenomenal not only success record from a box office perspective, but from a storytelling perspective as far as any studio goes, production company goes. Pixar's pretty outstanding, and this book really outlines the inner workings and systems in play to keep that streak alive, essentially. And this is actually where I got the idea for my brain trust, which I outlined in the very first episode of this season on writing the script. This is how I got the idea to surround myself with a group of people that I could constantly revisit for notes and for perspectives to improve upon a project and how to be open to those notes. But there's a ton of other great gems in this book, and it'll really inspire you. The next resource book is also listed in the show notes, The 4-Hour Work Week. The mythic 4-Hour Work Week. If you haven't read this, I highly recommend it. Mike got me on this one too many years ago. Based on the title alone, I was so resistant to this book. I thought that is the stupidest fucking title I've ever heard. It doesn't make sense. It's never going to happen. I don't want to read about it. I don't like that. But I ended up reading it, and it completely changed my life, my approach to work, my approach to efficiency, my approach to so many things in the professional arena, and it heavily informed how I managed my time making counterintelligence and how I manage my time in general. So I can't recommend this book highly enough. Among other things, it'll truly shift your perception of work life and work life balance. The next one that I want to recommend is The Bootstrapper's Guide. This is by Seth Godin, and it's an ebook. I believe it's a short PDF from what I recall. In truth, I didn't really think too much about this one until I was crafting these notes for resources, but it had an enormous impact on me. It really taught me in very short order how to build something from the ground up at very minimal expense. The sort of mental discipline and tools and tricks on an internal level and how to convey those and relay those into the real world. The impact went so far as teaching me and allowing me to fund a $15,000 premiere event for my last documentary film at no expense to me, with no money down. So I funded the event with the event, and that was a first for me, and it was a huge learning experience, and I carried much of that learning into counterintelligence with me, so I highly recommend it. It's a very quick read and a really great manual. The next thing I want to recommend is another podcast, the Filmmaker Freedom podcast by a guy that I am just now getting to know. His name is Rob Hardy. He runs a site called Filmmaker Freedom. But more importantly, his podcast, Filmmaker Freedom, is a great tool. I marathon the entire thing. I probably sent this podcast to more filmmakers I know than any podcast that is readily in mind. And the structure and format are very similar to this one in the sense that it is a concentrated season on a single topic. The first season is currently available, and the second season will be available shortly after the time of this recording, I believe. It is an excellent tool, so I highly recommend it. And the next is another podcast, Show Don't Tell podcast with Noam Kroll, another guy in the space that I'm getting to know soon. I listened to Noam Kroll's podcast, Show Don't Tell, quite a bit throughout the later stages of making this film, and all I could think was that I wish I had this podcast before I started making counterintelligence. There are so many nuggets in here that will benefit you in the early stages of making your film, just for preparation, for solid tactical thinking, and how to balance tact and creativity. Noam really excels at that. And then the final recommendation I have, this is the No Film School podcast, sub-podcast, I guess, the first feature amateur with No Film School founder Ryan Koo, where he, episode to episode, similar to Make This Movie, tells the story of how he made his first feature, which was on a much larger scale than Counterintelligence. Amateur is the name of the film. It's now available on Netflix. In his episodes, Ryan Koo, with a series of guests, contributors to No Film School and so forth, outline the step-by-step process of how the film went from concept to script to inevitably the screen. So I recommend that as well. Again, all of these tools and resources will be listed in the show notes. I highly recommend you check out one or all of them, if you're able to. I want to thank you for coming along on this ride so far with me. This podcast has been a great learning experience. It'll definitely make a great tool for me in the future to revisit. And I really hope, more than anything, that this podcast helps you get your film done with a really practical, pragmatic outline that you can always resort back to. I just really appreciate you listening to it so far. And I hope that it continues to prove helpful, and I hope that you love the rest. So that said, the next time you'll hear me in this informal fashion, maybe not outside, but you will hear me again in this informal fashion, will be after we get through production on the next 2 episodes of Make This Movie. Thanks for listening to Between the Frames. If you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen. While you're there, you could totally leave us a rating or a comment or both if you so choose. Those are easy ways to help spread the word to other listeners who like the same stuff as you. Music for the show comes from our film, Counterintelligence, and was composed by the great Noah Simons, who you can find on SoundCloud or Bandcamp as Larians, Larians, and his band, Male Blonding, on Bandcamp, iTunes, and Spotify. They're super good. Make This Movie is brought to you by Showhawk Media. If you're a filmmaker who wants even more useful info and tools, visit showhawk.com/makethismovie and sign up to access our free micro-budget producer starter kit, including template spreadsheets, documents, and other great stuff we cover throughout this series, ready for you to fill in the blanks. That's showhawk.com/makethismovie. Visit counterflick.com for more information on Counterintelligence, the movie, including fun stuff like our satirical fake news page. Also on Facebook is Counterintelligence, Twitter and Instagram @Counterflick. I'm Chris Socker. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
We just had to pull up our panties and dig on our cleats and just make do until it went away. And at the expense of cutting shots left and right, 6 different ways to Sunday.